Exactly.
Thank you. So let me remind those of you out there that if you have questions, write it down on your index cards and pass them in. I'd like to start by asking one question that the skeptics always say about these things. They say, oh, this sounds very nice and good, but it's basically boutique.
Right.
There's a district over here, a district over there. It's really not something that can be applied on scale, for teacher collective bargaining across the country. How would you respond to that view of the skeptics?
I can jump in. I will jump in because I absolutely have heard that about a considerable number of things. In the last 7 years, especially, while I was local union president and we were working to negotiate peer assistance and review so that we could address, so that our own membership could address teaching quality, ourselves and have a really progressive as well as tested way of doing that, as well as other things. Every time I would come up with this in the last 7 years especially, it was like, oh, but that's what St. Paul is doing, right? Or then when I'd be able to name a handful of, I'd say, well, but actually they're doing it in Connecticut and they're doing it in Maryland and they're doing it in New York and they're doing it in California. And they'd be like, well, yeah, I know you can name a handful of locals that are doing that, but it's really not at scale. And so it becomes the next battle defense of the people who want to maintain and flourish that narrative of teachers and our unions being deficits to meeting the needs of kids, that they have, that becomes their fallback. Well, it becomes their way of pivoting away from whatever good is happening to again focus on this mythical bad. And yet all of us who are working to use collective bargaining as the most powerful tool to improve meeting the needs of our students can point to different places where this is happening. I mean, our idea of inviting parents to the table to advocate directly for what their students needed came from Randy Weingarten's story of doing the same thing in New York, right? 5 years, I think, before we did it or something like that. And then we had, and then in Minnesota, there was this, this cascading experience of people who also wanted to open negotiations and invite students to talk about what it would mean to them to have the rights of GLBTQ students recognized in making sure their teachers could advocate for them fully in another district, and in addressing class size in another district. And so I would say actually that the onus is upon the skeptics to prove that this is boutique, because I feel like when I get together with other teachers who belong to unions, they no longer is the conversation in the parking lot, right? Or the second agenda after the staff meeting about despair over what are we going to do about our art teacher being cut, right? Or, when we're pulled together, are those despairing conversations? They're very energized conversations of this is how we did it in my local, right? Or here's how we're going to try it. Here's how we're going to train people in our state to do this. Or here was the outcome of us doing this when we wanted to address a community schools concept across our entire district. And so I actually feel like turning it right back on them and saying, actually, if you are paying attention, this is the norm, this is the infectious wave. And the more you try to frame it as boutiquey and suppress this wave of new visions for collective bargaining coming across all of our bargaining tables, the more you look like you're actually out of touch with what educators really want out of what we want and what we are getting out of our union memberships and our activism.
Tom?
Well, I think that states it very well. And the way we try to do this in Massachusetts is through that annual conference. Mm-hmm. We bring the teams that are doing it together with the skeptics. And we work on bringing people who have considered maybe doing some of this but have rejected it. And we orchestrate the groups to meet with each other and talk peer to peer about their experiences. And it's not all successful. Sometimes there are problems with it, and sometimes it's not quite as successful as you would like, but it's a step forward. And so it's an honest exchange of ideas, and then a commitment to say we will provide the training to follow through if someone is interested. So you can't force it on people, but you create the opportunities for people to see how it works, to talk with others about how it works, to bring the skeptics into the process. And we've had a few people, converts are always the most religious once they get religion. Well, we've had a few of those, and I've seen it not only in this example, but I've seen it in others that do a lot of work or have done a lot of work. We're not doing it right now, but with Kaiser Permanente, which is a big labor management partnership. It's been going since 1997. It's the biggest, most comprehensive one in the country in the history of collective bargaining in the United States. And we have brought lots of people to see what's going on at Kaiser who are kind of skeptical of it. And then we brought skeptics within Kaiser into this process. And you can see once you get them, particularly, for example, the doctors, the physicians, they think they're next to God, especially the surgeons. They think they are God. And they have been very skeptical of working in teams with nurses and service employees and technicians and so on. But once they see that it's helping them do their job and treat their patients or serve their patients better, they become the strongest advocates. So you've got to bring those people in. I can't convince them. I can show them all kinds of data. Perhaps that's not going to do it. It has to be those personal stories. And so if we want to diffuse this, it's got to be through these narratives. It's got to be through stories like St. Paul or Boston or whatever examples we have, and it's got to be the people who did it talking with others. And if the leadership of the AFT, as I know it is committed to this, then getting the membership out talking to their peers across the country, I think, has the strongest effect.
Yeah.
Good. So here's a very interesting question. In my lifetime as a local union leader attempting to negotiate innovative agreements and procedures, the bane of my existence was lawyers. And so and lawyers are precisely trained to be adversarial, and they also bring their frame to collective bargaining negotiations. Try to negotiate teacher evaluation with a bunch of union lawyers who are thinking like defense attorneys and a bunch of board lawyers who are thinking like prosecutors. So this question says, did you have any pushback from your union lawyers about this new vision of bargaining, and how did you deal with it?
We actually did not. So St. Paul is a large enough local where I was a full-time release president from my classroom duties, but not large enough where we had our own legal team on staff. And so we really relied on Education Minnesota's and AFT's legal team, of course. And I think part of what helped, perhaps, was keeping them informed of the process the entire time. Really helped them also feel like, also helped them feel like partners, and not so much caught off guard by, you asked what to whom, and it was recorded, or whatever their reaction may have been. And so again, sort of treating them as part of the team. And this is that power sharing piece where we recognized that we have a considerable amount of power at the collective bargaining table, right? Sharing that power meant sharing. It didn't mean just letting you watch us use our power. And so part of that is sort of treating everyone like a team as you shape things. And I think that helped for us.
Tom, you have any experience?
I've had both experiences. I once gave a talk. I was never invited back to the Massachusetts Municipal Association, and talked about the partnership because we were just getting it off the ground, and said that this could apply to other areas and I got exactly this question, Leo, from somebody in the audience and said, well, but our lawyers tell us that, this will never work and that this is a bad idea. What do you have to say to them? I said, fire them. They're your lawyers. Get other ones. And there are lawyers who are very good at interest-based negotiations or facilitating and working in this way, whether they call it that or not. But fundamentally, the lawyers work for us or for your organizations. And if you include them, you'll find a lot of them are very skilled. Obviously, they've been skilled in working on these issues. And they do develop relationships with their counterparts if they're good professionals. And then some of them will just see it as a threat. Well, that's too bad. Then don't hire them, de-hire them, whatever you have to do, and they'll eventually come around. So I'm not too concerned. It's a transition. I think law schools are doing a much better job now of training and teaching prospective lawyers. Now, there aren't many labor lawyers coming out of law schools anymore because the demand for them has gone down. But the training of problem solving in the law profession is growing. And so I think that's an asset. I think there's no shortage of people who can facilitate it.
Good. There are two questions which are sort of cover the same area, and that's that both Massachusetts and Minnesota are states that respect the right to collective bargaining, and they're both basically blue states. What does all of this mean for those of us who are living in states that are red states where there are hostile governors and state legislatures who don't respect collective bargaining?
Let me just make one comment, and now I'm going to really alienate people because I have been so angry with the labor movement in Wisconsin. They have really botched, the recall election against Walker, then the second election, because they didn't have what you're talking about, a vision for the future of collective bargaining. They just said, it's unfair, we're going after him, get rid of him, he's evil. All that's true, but it doesn't sell. It doesn't sell in the Midwest. And when they bring a candidate who is unclear about what his or her vision is for building the next generation of labor relations and what's possible, this kind of vision, they're silent. And so Wisconsin never had a choice about the future. Now, Wisconsin's not the most red state. It happens to be, at the moment, a terrible political environment. But I think the people of Wisconsin are thirsty for a positive vision, not a negative vision. Don't go and attack Walker again. You've tried that. Show that there's an alternative, and a much more positive alternative, and the good common sense of the people of the state of Wisconsin will come around to it and say, well, what we have now is really terrible because nobody's talking to everybody, to each other, and let's look at what we can do. And if it's pragmatic and it's positive and it's sensible and it passes the common sense test, it'll win in Wisconsin.
And I'd like to add as well that I think sometimes we need to acknowledge that we get really anxious about our ambitions, and we hear these amazing stories come out of, perhaps it was a collective bargaining setting that won this great contract language around class size, for example. And you might be a labor leader in a deeply red state that has, that you're lucky you feel like you have some sort of meet and confer agreement. And so you are anxious for that sort of ambition as well. But there are a few different places where you can still find areas of common ground. And I would actually start with, or find those areas of leveraging the power you have. And I would actually start with becoming recognized as the professionals we are, whether that is an educator or a nurse or healthcare professional or higher education faculty, that you are hired for your expertise in your field. And the thing that we still, the thing we still combat, even in a collective bargaining state, is this disconnect between hiring me for my expertise in meeting the needs of students, but then refusing to recognize my expertise in meeting the needs of students at my collective bargaining table. So we are actually still, like, we are sort of in that same position. And so if you are in a place where you are a scrappy union in a red state looking to make progress around around the schools children deserve, looking for those places where you can have those, have those small victories, so to speak, where you are recognizing your expertise, and maybe it is the sort of leverage you have as, with your principal in making sure that it is a teacher and paraprofessional team that constructs your schedule for that year, right? It is the fourth grade teachers who help design moving the fourth grade students on to fifth grade for the fifth grade teachers. And I would say starting in those places closest to home, and driving whatever decision-making process you can as close to the classroom as possible. So teachers and paraprofessionals in the education case start practicing building the sort of working and learning conditions students deserve at that level, and building out from there. Never abdicate the expertise that is recognized by the fact that you were hired to meet the needs of students, and start there by owning that expertise and building out the problem solving from there. I would say as one place, when you feel like, getting that governor flipped or getting that state legislature flipped is a heavy lift. We got a plan for it, but it's a heavy lift. However, using our staff meeting time to actually talk about why our students deserve an art and music, whatever, like that's a powerful place to start, actually. It really is. And the relationships often are the strongest and the deepest there among teachers and paraprofessionals and administrators and students and families to solve those problems together.
So let's take another skeptic question. There are those who say that labor and management have no interests in common, and that and this comes from both sides. And so somehow talking about partnership and collaboration is a betrayal. So, Michelle Rhee will say, collaboration is very overrated, right? And we probably all run into critics in our unions who say, when you talk about partnership and collaboration, you're talking about betraying the interests of teachers. So how would you respond to critics with that point of view?
Well, let me go back to the Boston case, because clearly that is part of the culture of that labor management relationship, where the mayor saw nothing but a zero-sum game. You have to reframe it. So they couldn't get an agreement on the extended school day because the AFT, or the Boston Teachers Federation, was demanding a certain percentage of salary increase for every minute, and the city and the superintendent couldn't get together on what they would actually offer, and it broke down because of a dollar issue. Well, as long as when we first started having those conversations, it became clear that if we're going to just talk about that, we're not going to get anywhere. So let's reframe this. Let's reframe it. How would we use this time? What would this time be used for? And it was, and I'm telling a little bit out of school here, but it was Richard Stutman who said, we've got to make sure there's good professional development and good professional development time built in. Mm-hmm. And once he started talking about that, and John McDonough said, well, that's right. I agree with that. We need to do this in a way that makes sense, and we've got to expand professional development time. It can't be all of that. And once we said, instead of thinking about just proportionate dollar, hourly wage rates, let's think about what's a fair sharing of this time, and let's talk about a professional stipend that it gets built into the base and all of that, but let's get away from this hourly wage rate and reframe it. Then we could start thinking about how are we going to use the time, how are we going to pay for it, what's it going to cost, and it won't come across as the teachers demanding a cents per hour increase in their hourly rate for additional time. So framing it in a way that makes it sound and makes it in reality a problem-solving process can often transform what is a totally zero-sum game. And that's the way we've got to then communicate it back to the constituencies on all sides, because there are multiple. There's certainly the teachers. You got to communicate it. Why does this make sense for us, and how are we benefiting as well as benefiting the children, and achieving something that we all know we need to do? How are we going to communicate it to the school committee, to the Boston Globe, and how is the mayor going to be able to sell it? The mayor sold it by saying, we just added a month to the school year, and we're sharing in the costs of it, and we're sharing in both the students having more time in the classroom and teachers having more professional development time. It's not rocket science. It just says there are ways to find something in these processes for everybody.
I also think, I do think it's a great question, and we cannot gloss over the skepticism that collaboration from either side, right? That collaboration feels somehow like selling out, or somehow like I lost power. We have to hear people when they say that. Because oftentimes, when I sort of scratch below the surface of that, what I hear is not so much that the issue isn't actually collaboration. Because you can find examples of people who vehemently believe the union should never collaborate with management, who collaborate in their personal lives all the time, right? Who have these brilliant 30-year marriages that I gotta believe got there with some collaboration, right? Or who their children get along, and I've gotta believe that happens because of some collaboration. Who make good neighbors, and I've gotta believe that happens not just because of good fences, but because of some collaboration. And so scratching beneath the surface, oftentimes when I would encounter those skeptics, like, what collaboration meant to them was capitulation, right? Or it meant disrespect. I cannot enter in a collaborative relationship with someone who has disrespected me. And what did that disrespect look like? And sometimes that disrespect happened 12 years ago, and sort of there's been nothing since, not even a détente, but it's you're laughing because it's true, right? You laugh to keep from crying. And sometimes that disrespect is incredibly fresh. And so getting to the bottom of what's holding someone back from feeling like they can enter into a collaborative discussion, that may not lead to an agreement, right? We had very tense negotiations in St. Paul. They were very tense. But to even have a collaborative discussion meant we had to address perhaps what was holding people back from wanting to discuss our mutual interest in teachers being able to get homework back in a timely fashion, which meant having, not having 180 students in your grade book, or that mutual interest in being able to offer some personalized learning, which meant not having those 37 students in your Algebra 2 class, right? And so, but we had to get at, if you are afraid, and I would have to say this to members, right? And I would have to also hear them. If you're saying you don't want us to collaborate, do you really mean, getting at that conversation, do you really mean you don't want us to capitulate? Because let's have that conversation of what that looks like to you. Or do you feel like you were so disrespected by management, right, in our case, that you just can't see coming to common ground with them? Then that's actually something we need to address, because we actually are all in this business to meet the needs of students. And so I actually do think that it's imperative on us when we hear that skepticism to know that it is coming from a place that needs addressing and needs respecting.
Thank you. So there's a question, I think, for folks who are interested in seeing what other districts around the country are doing with innovative collective bargaining, what would be good places for them to go to find that information?
Well, I would say AFT members to please contact, please contact us and go to our website. We are offering, every time we put on a conference or, hold some sort of webinar, we are addressing new visions for collective bargaining, quite frankly. And so it's there wherever we're offering it. And I would say reach out to, whether you want to reach out to AFT nationally, reach out to AFT locals around the country. Local presidents and state Fed presidents are incredibly accessible people, and asking them where are these new visions for collective bargaining happening, or what has been your latest new approach to collective bargaining. I think they're actually in communities across the country. To my earlier point,
Tom.
Well, and I agree. Go to the unions themselves and learn from them. There are other resources. The Center for American Progress has had a good report that I recommend. If you just look at Center for American Progress and put in either labor management partnerships or Saul Rubenstein, you'll get a very good report on his work. You can go to our website, which is at the Rennie Center and in Massachusetts. The Rennie Center is where we house this partnership, and they have a long history of working on these issues before we created the partnership, and continue to house it there. And we summarize what we're doing in different districts, in the larger picture in the state, and there's resources there as well.
Thank you. So would the two of you like to make some concluding remarks?
Sure. Do you want me to jump in first?
Sure. Go ahead.
Well, again, I'll end in the way I started as well, by thanking the Schenker Institute, because this is also, we need multiple ways of having people come together and think about new visions for collective bargaining. That is a very potent way of getting people to rethink collective bargaining opportunities we have in front of us. And given that, I will say one of all of the things I did to prepare myself to go from being a local president to being a national executive vice president, I felt like I did a fairly good job thinking of what my role would be and what my responsibilities would be. And it was so I was elected in July of 2014. And so it was September of 2014, and something crossed my desk. I can't remember what it was, but it triggered a response in me. And I realized I was like, oh, I don't get to negotiate contracts anymore. I loved negotiating contracts. And I realized, and it hit me, I was like, why didn't I think of that before? And I realized, and it wasn't just it wasn't sort of the thrill of perhaps, two sides and, heightened tension and, all of that. So it wasn't necessarily the adrenaline rush one might get out of, tense contract negotiations. What I missed about it, what kind of that longing that sort of hit me was this idea where I felt like it was such a natural marriage of why I went into teaching in the first place, right? And I will borrow a phrase from my departed U.S. Senator Paul Wellstone when I say that I went into teaching to improve people's lives. And when I decided to become a union leader, I went into union leadership actually for the same reason, to improve people's lives. And there was, when I was first elected president of St. Paul, there was, again, we were still we were still exploring what that very traditional unionism lens meant of being a union leader. And when I started reshaping collective bargaining to mean that collective bargaining was going to mean that our contract was the most powerful document the district had to attract and retain a diverse workforce, and that our contract was going to be the agreement we had with the community for the schools our children deserve, I realized that I had melded those two ambitions of mine together, that I was able to improve people's lives through negotiating, right? For the schools our children deserve. And that is, I think, what made me most wistful in that moment. And so, I would go back to those first ambitions I had that I explained to you, with that, coming to the bargaining table, and using the bargaining table as a way of solving those most pernicious problems, whether they are in a school, a hospital, a college campus, or public employment, you name it. Like, that is some amazing work that can happen, that can immediately sort of bring the community's concerns into solving problems in a really potent way. And so with that said, if anyone wants to invite me to your bargaining table, I am still interested. But it became that place where I felt like my work was at its most potent.
Tom?
I love this term, a new vision for collective bargaining in education. I think we need a new vision for collective bargaining in general in this country.
Yeah.
And the stories that we're talking about here today are part of that vision. And my hope is that we can take this vision out to the public. The public needs to be educated about what collective bargaining can do to address the issues in our society, to bring to end this divisiveness and this bigotry and this attack on people who happen to be different or come from different places, and to bring some sense that through the use of positive collective bargaining, we can overcome those differences, we can recognize and legitimate the differences, we can learn from them, and we can start talking with each other and solving problems that have been intractable. I just finished, as Cheryl knows, teaching an online course at MIT and it's called Shaping the Future of Work. And there are a number of messages in the course, but one that resonated with these people, and these are students from all over the world, but a large number from the United States, and they're not just students, they're anyone who wants to take the course. So the average age is 31, so they're not just students. A lot of them are, and a lot of them are in the workforce. This notion that we've got to we can't solve our problems and we can't really shape the future of work in a positive way unless we get business and labor and education and government leaders working together. Mm-hmm. People are so thirsty for that. Mm-hmm. And we've got the tools, and we've got the people who can articulate it from real world experiences on the power of collective bargaining. That this should be front and center in the national dialogue, that we can use this process in a modern way to address these divisions, forget about whether it's a mandatory or non-mandatory or permissive subject. Let's deal with the issues that people worry about today and deal with what's creating this enormous frustration that we're observing and experiencing firsthand in our society today, and start to address it incrementally, issue by issue. That's the power of collective bargaining. That's a vision. But we've got to get that word out, and we've got to get our political leaders stating that vision and endorsing that vision and saying that we will have a new regime of collective bargaining with some force behind it moving forward. I think that would be a very, very well-received and powerful message to the American public, and it would help us address a lot of the problems that divide us.
So I'd like you all to join me in thanking our two panelists for excellent conversation. We will be back here next month for our last in this year's series, Bridges, Not Walls, Teaching English Language Learners in an Era of Immigrant Bashing. All right.
Yeah.